Hey guys, this is Mike, letusreason.com. This is going to be the second video in our teaching series on the Olivet Discourse. In the previous video, we started out by going over some basic biblical definitions and concepts in eschatology that need to be understood first before even starting to dive into this discourse itself. And we allowed the Bible to self-define these terms. We have to understand it the way it wants to be understood, which in some cases yields a very different picture than the definitions given by many popular Bible prophecy teachers today. First, we looked at the concept of the day of the Lord and found it to have both a twofold nature and a double sense. As far as a twofold or dual nature, it begins with a period of darkness and judgment and then transitions into a period of light and blessing. As far as a double sense, it has both a broad sense and a narrow sense. The broad sense begins when the rapture takes place, is followed by a post-rapture gap period, then the 7-year tribulation, and then the 1,000-year millennial kingdom. Whereas the narrow sense relates to the culmination or the climax of the judgment phase at the end of the tribulation, when Jesus returns physically to judge the earth and to bring the raptured church with him. And for clarity, I like to refer to this as the second coming proper, since his coming, or his parousia in the Greek, is an extended time period beginning with his coming to receive the church at the rapture and then extending until the end of the tribulation when he returns with us. All of this is the parousia, because according to the way this Greek word parousia is used in the scriptures, this is what it encompasses. Similar to how the first coming wasn't just limited to his birth or crucifixion, but instead was the entire time period between the two. All of that was his first coming. Well, the second coming is also going to take place over a period of time, not just one 24-hour day. So we found that the day of the Lord is not in any way a synonym for the tribulation. It begins suddenly when simultaneously the righteous are removed and rescued at the rapture, and then judgment immediately begins to fall on the wicked who are left. And we then identified that judgment that suddenly begins as what Jesus refers to as the beginning of birth pangs, or the Greek word Odin in Matthew 24, 5-8. Connecting it with Paul's usage of that same Greek word Odin in 1 Thessalonians 5, 2-3. And then recognizing that the birth pang signs that Jesus described actually identically line up to the sealed judgments of Revelation chapter 6. Now, what was the ultimate point of all that? Well, just to recognize that the Bible is clear that the eschatological birth pangs occur not during the church age, not right now, but later, once the day of the Lord starts. So they occur during the broad period of the day of the Lord, all right? Or the day of the Lord in its broadest sense. So we're not seeing birth pang signs now, nor at any point during the church age. We can't. They're not church age events. They begin suddenly as the opening judgment signs of the broad day that begin immediately once the church is raptured. And Paul explained to us that it happens out of a context of routine normalcy. Jesus did too. And people have the expectation of peace and safety. Nothing out of the ordinary has happened yet. And then, boom, the righteous are removed suddenly, and the birth pang judgments start, which continue to build and increase until the end of the tribulation. And then after that, we gave some additional perspective as to what the rapture is, which I would assume that most people who follow this channel at least already know. So we didn't spend much time on it. But it's the supernatural carrying away of the church from earth to heaven immediately prior to the outpouring of eschatological judgment. The dead in Christ, we know, as well as those who are alive and remain, receive glorified resurrection bodies and are brought to the Father's house for a time period. Then we spent a couple of moments defining the concept of eschatological imminence, something so important in this series, this teaching on the Olivet Discourse. Because imminence is a key consideration in determining eschatological context. Anytime you identify imminence language anywhere in the New Testament related to Christ's parousia, related to the day of the Lord, related to the end times, related to the rapture, it helps you identify exactly what aspect of the parousia is in view. The absolute beginning, which is the beginning of the broad day of the Lord, or the ending or climax, which is the second coming proper at the end of the tribulation. Well, if it's using imminence language, it can only be discussing the absolute beginning, never the ending or the climax, because imminence refers to something that's expected at any moment, without signs, without preconditions, or anything else that needs to happen first. It's something that 100% is possible at any moment, which can only apply to the absolute beginning of the broad day when the rapture takes place. Anything after that, once you enter into that time period, it can no longer satisfy the actual definition of imminence because everything that follows is a very well defined, very well expected sequence of signs, one after another, with a somewhat clearly defined countdown. We're given all that information, how many years it's going to be, how many months, how many days. And during that time period, the Bible's clear that even the wicked earth dwellers understand exactly what's happening. They know that they're experiencing divine judgments. They know that they're in the day of the Lord, and they actually know that he's going to return. So much so that they're actually preparing to fight him, we're told. So in other words, there's nothing at all imminent. There's nothing at all signless. There's nothing unpredictable happening at this time. There's nothing taking anyone off guard at this time. Nothing is happening without warning at this time. All of those are imminence characteristics, and they only apply to the absolute beginning of the broad day, the beginning of the parousia, the beginning of eschatology, the beginning of what we call the end times, which is when the rapture occurs. Because the Bible speaks of the rapture and the beginning of the broad day as being imminent, coming suddenly, without signs, without warning. So the Bible often uses imminence language, as I like to call it, to convey that kind of context, such as when it says the Lord is coming soon or shortly or quickly, and that his coming is near or at hand, that he's coming like a thief or he's at the door. They all convey imminence. They're all equivalent. They're saying the same thing, meaning that anytime you encounter them, it's a very strong indicator of the context as being the beginning of the broad day, and certainly not the end of the tribulation. That simple understanding is going to play a very foundational role in helping us understand each section of the Olivet Discourse. Like I said in the first video, this series is going to be all about context because the context dictates the view that you have to take on the Olivet Discourse. It answers all the questions about what Jesus is talking about. What part of the discourse refers to what part of the chronology of the end times? And who are the righteous in the discourse? The church? Israel? Is the rapture in the discourse anywhere? Etc. So applying these simple understandings about the context are going to conclusively force us to some very simple answers. Okay, so that's the review of what we discussed in the previous video. If you didn't watch it, I would strongly recommend that you watch it before you watch this one. It just grounds everything I just said. And with that said, we can now begin our next section, which is an introduction to the Olivet Discourse. And the purpose of this is going to be to supply some background about the discourse itself. So, as Jesus' earthly ministry progressed toward its culmination, he began to progressively reveal new eschatological truths that related to his future return, his coming, his parousia, the second coming. After Israel rejected him as Messiah, of course, it was only then that the necessity of the second coming began to come into view. And so Jesus at that point began to progressively, gradually reveal these new truths a little bit at a time. And the Olivet Discourse was the culmination of these gradual revelations about his parousia. Now, why do we even call it the Olivet Discourse? Well, it's because it took place on the Mount of Olives, which is a hill that overlooks Jerusalem. And like we mentioned at the outset, this discourse is recorded in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew 24 and continuing into Matthew 25, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. And in this video, we're going to focus mainly on Matthew 24, which is the most detailed recording of the 3, although we will mention parts of the others for context. And so what happened to kick this whole discourse off was that Jesus and his disciples were passing by the temple buildings, and the disciples began to remark about the grandeur of its construction, the large stones, that were used. And Jesus surprised them all by saying that all of these stones would be thrown down and the temple would be destroyed. So let me show you this in Matthew 24, 1 to 2, which says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Verse 3 then tells us that Jesus' disciples, who were told as Peter, James, John, and Andrew, as we're told in the Mark account, later came to him privately on the Mount of Olives, inquiring about what he had just said. And they asked Jesus what may seem in English like three questions, but we're going to find out that they're actually two questions, and both concern the same overall subject, the broad day of the Lord, which establishes the context for Jesus's response, which is what the Olivet Discourse is. The Olivet Discourse is just Jesus's response to those questions. So the context is the broad day of the Lord, or what we call the end times or eschatology. So let's take a look at this in verse 3. It says, "And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" Now, I mentioned that it may seem as though they're asking three questions, the way it's translated or the way that it comes across in the English. But when you look closer at this, especially in the original language, it's actually two questions. I'm going to read to you the words of one scholar, Dr. Craig Bloomberg, on this. And he says this: "The sign of your coming and of the end of the age," in Greek, reads more literally, "the sign of your coming and end of the age." By not repeating the definite article the before end of the age, Matthew's rendering of Jesus' words is most likely linking the coming of Christ and the end of the age together as one event. Now, in the disciples' Jewish understanding of eschatology that they knew, of course, from the Hebrew Bible, their Jewish expectation of the coming of the Messiah, in this case, referring to what we Christians would call the second coming, their expectation was that this was an event that concluded the present age and introduced a new messianic or kingdom age, or what the Old Testament always refers to as the day of the Lord. And in that day, all right, it's talked about constantly throughout the books of the Old Testament prophets, especially. And this is what would have molded the disciples' understanding at that time and their expectation. And this is what they were thinking about when they came and asked Jesus about the sign of his coming and of the end of the age. The eschatological day of the Lord. That's what they were talking about. That's the whole context for this. But a further point is that it's obvious that the disciples would have also associated the context of their first question about when the temple would be destroyed with this same time period. All right. So, in other words, all aspects of their two questions related to this same context, the eschatological day of the Lord. So, let me show you another quote. This is from Dr. Stanley Toussaint, basically saying what we just said. And he writes this: "In their mind, they had developed a chronology of events in the following sequence. Number one, the departure of the king. Number two, after a period of time, the destruction of Jerusalem. And number three, immediately after Jerusalem's devastation, the presence of the Messiah. They had good scriptural ground for this, since Zechariah 14, 1 to 2 describes the raising of Jerusalem. The same passage goes on to describe the coming of the Lord to destroy the nations which warred against Jerusalem, Zechariah 14, 3 to 8. Following this, the millennial kingdom is established, Zechariah 14, 9 to 11. So their whole understanding of what would happen was taken right from the Old Testament in places like Zechariah 14, which talks about the nations gathering against Jerusalem and the destruction of the city. And then the context of Zechariah 14, of course, is during the day of the Lord. Zechariah 14:1, it literally begins by saying, "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh." So you know that's the context. And so again, the entire mindset of the disciples, because they were relating this to that, was relating to a context of the future day of the Lord when all these things were rightly expected to take place. So again, that's their understanding of the Olivet Discourse. They were asking those questions with the context of the day of the Lord in mind, okay? But let me show you another quote. This is from Dr. Tommy Ice, and he says this: the disciples were right to think of Zechariah 12 to 14 and Zechariah's teaching about Messiah's coming. However, they were wrong to relate the impending judgment of Jerusalem, which Jesus was talking about, and the temple, meaning the one Jesus was describing to them, with the return of Messiah. All right, I hope you followed that. So the disciples, for very good reason, assumed that the temple's destruction that Jesus was talking about was associated with the end times, with the day of the Lord, and the events that Zechariah and other prophets talked about that are going to one day happen, which we can think of as a far term context. But they didn't realize that there was also a near term historical destruction of Jerusalem that would take place when Jerusalem was to be attacked by the Romans only about 40 years later, around 70 AD. In the most immediate sense, that's what Jesus was referring to here, unbeknownst to them at that time. But we're going to find that Jesus actually addresses both contexts, near term and far term, in his answer, or meaning in what we call the Olivet Discourse, if we were to aggregate or combine all three of the recordings. He answers both. A lot of people don't know that. So I hope that gives you some idea of the context, as now we're going to move on to our next section of the video, which I'm calling the two contrasting halves of the discourse. We're going to now look even deeper into the context, and this is going to give us all the answers that we need. So going back to the questions Jesus was being asked by the disciples, if you're Jesus and they're asking you this, how are you going to answer these questions, especially this when question? Because you know, because you're Jesus, that there's a near-term fulfillment that the disciples don't know about. Jesus knew that they assumed the far-term fulfillment to be the context of what he was saying, because they're asking about the end of the age and his coming at the end of the age. But Jesus knew that there was both a near-term and a far-term fulfillment. But the way that the disciples framed their questions were obviously related to the day of the Lord context or the far-term fulfillment. They were associating it with his coming at the end of the age. And so Jesus had to answer both. And that's exactly what we do find. Now, here's the point of confusion. Jesus never mentions the near-term 70 AD destruction by the Romans in Matthew's recording, or in Mark for that matter. This near-term destruction context is only found in Luke chapter 21. And yet, here's the interesting thing. I want you to get this. Matthew 24 and Mark 13 still record the when will these things be question, or when will the destruction of the temple be? So why would you still record the question if Jesus didn't answer it in that chapter? Well, I want you to listen to this very closely, because you're not going to hear this very often. The common interpretation is that Jesus didn't answer this when will the destruction of the temple be question at all in Matthew and Mark. Did not. But it would seem strange and maybe even a bit deceptive that Matthew would still record the question if Jesus provided no answer to it in his account. And so an alternative view that I'm convinced is the correct interpretation and is one that just much better fits the facts is that Jesus does in fact answer this when question in Matthew 24. He does it in the latter portion of the chapter, what I'm going to call the latter half of the discourse, beginning at verse 36 and continuing even into Matthew 25, the next chapter, all the way until about verse 13. And these verses clearly do address the when aspect of the broad day of the Lord. But you might say, well, I thought the disciples were asking when related to the temple's destruction. Let me explain it this way. In Matthew's recording, instead of referring to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, or the near-term context, Jesus' when answer focuses on the timing of the day of the Lord, since the disciples' assumption in their question was that the temple's destruction related to the end of the age, or when the day of the Lord happens. That was their question. It was all about the day of the Lord. And so, in other words, The Bible simply answers the question according to the theme and the context of each chapter. In Luke 21, that chapter's uniqueness among the other recordings is that it's the only one that provides the answer about the near term context, the events of 70 AD. Whereas in Matthew 24, like Mark 13, the primary emphasis is only very obviously centered on giving understanding concerning the far term sequence of signs within the eschatological broad day of the Lord. And so Jesus' answer to the same question seems to be deliberately recorded differently by the Holy Spirit's inspiration of the writers according to his intended context and purpose within each of these recordings. Obviously, each chapter has a specific intention and purpose according to the mind of God. Each was intended to teach about a certain thing, a certain subject. And so it makes sense to understand that those purposes were actually achieved. Again, in Matthew's recording, Jesus does not at all address the 70 AD context, the near term context, but instead answers the disciples' when question in the latter half of the discourse, beginning at verse 36. And he does it by communicating the unpredictability of the broad day of the Lord, which is a perfect fit for an answer to the disciples' first question about when. That's an answer to a when question. The answer is it's unpredictable. It's unknowable. That then is the continuing theme all throughout the remainder of these verses. That's Jesus' answer. And again, Luke's account is unique in that it addresses the timing of the 70 AD destruction, the short term. And the sign that he provides, remember, they also ask for the sign, is found in verse 20. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. That was the sign for the near-term 70 AD fulfillment. However, Luke 21 also, later on, addresses the timing of the day of the Lord context. He does it in verses 34 to 36, which very closely resemble Jesus' words in Matthew 24, 36 to 51, and also in Mark 13, 32 to 37. So if you're taking notes, you want to write those down. You want to go back. You want to compare. We're going to do some of that here today. Now, if you compare all three of those segments, they all align, and it's clear that they're all speaking about the beginning of the broad day, the ultimate context. So all three recordings follow this same format of addressing the ultimate far-term context, but only Luke 21 discusses the near-term fulfillment in 70 AD. All right? Hope you're following this. So, according to this understanding, we can see that Jesus' answer in Matthew 24, as well as in Mark and Luke, was structured as a chiasm. Now, what's a chiasm? A chiasm is a literary device that's often seen in the Bible, and in fact, very often in Matthew, where a sequence of ideas is presented, and then it's repeated back in the reverse order. And I'm going to show you this quote by Dr. John Hart, who explains it perfectly. It is true that in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Jesus does not take up the AD 70 event. However, this does not necessitate that the first question of the disciples remains unanswered in the discourse. Contrarily, it's likely that Jesus answered both questions of Matthew 24:3, but in reverse order. From a literary point of view, Matthew structures these as a chiasm. It is well known that Matthew brings order and precision to his gospel. Chiastic structures in Matthew are quite common and are fully appropriate in light of his precision. So he says the chiasm is as follows. A1 question, when will these things happen? Verse 3a. B1 question, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Verse 3b. B2 answer, what will be the sign of my coming and of the end of the age? Verses 4 to 35. A2 answer, when will these things happen? Verses 36 to 44. Let me explain what he just said even more clearly, and I made this chart to keep it simple. What we're saying is that in the first half of the discourse, Jesus answers their second question, the question about the signs of his parousia and the end of the age, the what question. What will be the signs? And then in the latter half of the discourse, he answers their first question about when it will be, or the issue of the timing. the when question. And what we're simply saying is that in Matthew and Mark's recordings, Jesus' answer to the when question focuses on the day of the Lord, or the far term context that the disciples had really baked into their question. Remember, they had assumed that was when the destruction of the temple that Jesus prophesied of took place. And not only do we know that that was their assumption simply because the Old Testament speaks about it, and as Jews, that's what they knew, but also because they explicitly baked it into their question by mentioning the end of the age. So we know exactly what they had in mind. They're asking him about the parousia in the day of the Lord. And therefore, Jesus had to answer that context, that question. But yet, Jesus' actual context in his statement about the temple being destroyed, his intention referred to a near term context that they didn't know about. And so Jesus also had to answer that. He couldn't just ignore his actual intended context just because his disciples assumed it was something else. And so he addresses that near term context in Luke 21, although, as I said before, Luke 21 then also addresses the far term context, the unpredictable timing of the day of the Lord, in verses 34 to 36. So if you've never heard it explained this way, it may seem a little bit complex, but yet it makes total sense in light of all these nuances. So let's do an actual review of Matthew 24 and see how the narrative flows. This is going to allow us to understand and talk more about these things and much more as we go through it in sort of more like a verse by verse. So in this discourse, as we've already seen, as Jesus begins to answer the second question first, he starts by describing what he calls the beginning of birth pangs. And then after that, he proceeds to the great tribulation signs, like the abomination of desolation and everything that's associated with that time. And then he finally concludes with the final sign, which is his physical coming in the sky at the end of the tribulation, which I like to refer to as the second coming proper. And then he discusses the final worldwide regathering of Israel that takes place after the ending of the tribulation in preparation for millennial blessings. And then after that, he uses a parable of the budding of a fig tree to summarize what he just described and to inform them that the same generation is going to witness that whole sequence. Or in other words, the same generation that sees the beginning of birth pang signs is the same generation that would also witness the final climactic sign of him coming in the sky at the end of the tribulation. So he therefore then limits the entire period of this to less than one generation. The same people are going to see both, the beginning and the ending. It's not going to stretch on for hundreds of years. All of this happens during the judgment phase of the broad day of the Lord, which he limits to less than one generation. All right? Hope you're following that. Now, after all this is where the context abruptly changes, and it begins at verse 36. And this is in many ways the key to understanding the Olivet Discourse. If you're confused about the discourse, it's probably most likely due to the fact that you're overlooking this context shift. But it's extremely obvious when you start to pay attention to it. But here in verse 36, which begins what I'm calling the latter half of the discourse, is where the shift takes place. And if somebody ever makes claims or tries to teach you about the Olivet Discourse and doesn't mention this, doesn't address this shift, and doesn't actually make it the primary thing for rightly dividing this discourse, please make a big mental note of that and be very careful about listening to what they teach you. If they overlook this shift, I can pretty much guarantee you they're not telling you the right thing about the discourse as a whole. They're taking you down the wrong road. Because it's like that rule in real estate, location, location, location. In Bible study, it's all about context, context, context. And if you don't point out this shift in context as a teacher of the Olivet Discourse, you're going to be off the mark, guaranteed. You're not going to understand the context because the context shifts. And really, if you're paying attention, guys, it's actually hard to miss. I don't know how so many people miss this. I think it's because they have a pre-established understanding of how they think things go, and then they try to fit the Olivet Discourse into that. Because everything at this point in the discourse, it abruptly changes from signs to signlessness. Here in verse 36, we see that the context notably and obviously, unmistakably shifts from a discussion of observable signs preceding his second coming proper, right? It was all the signs in the broad day leading up to the second coming proper. That's everything that was talked about before this. But then in verse 36, it changes from the signs to now a discussion of the non-existence of any observable signs that precede the onset of this broad period as a whole. I hope you understood that. So beginning at verse 36, it shifts in perspective back to the beginning of the entire period that Jesus had just finished describing the signs that take place in that period. Now he's discussing the conditions of a relative calm, relative normalcy, and complete unpredictability and lack of any observable signs that take place immediately prior to the sudden onset of those signs, of the beginning of birth pang signs, and everything that follows it in the sequence that he had just laid out in that first half of the discourse. So in the what I'm calling again the latter half of the discourse, beginning at verse 36 here, the shift is now turning to answer the disciples' first question about the when. When shall these things be? He had already answered their second question about the signs first, and now he's going to answer their first question. All right, that's the chiasm. The second question got addressed first. Now he's going to the first question. That's why the abrupt change in context, where he's finished answering the first question about the signs. Again, I'm taking this slow, I'm being repetitive on purpose so that you get it. The first half of the discourse, he gave them the entire sequence of signs in the broad day. They were asking about the signs, he answered that. And now he's shifting the perspective to say that prior to the beginning of that period, it's going to be life as usual, with no observable signs of any kind to tell you that it's suddenly about to begin. That's why the description is so opposite. Once the period begins, it's all the signs that he just talked about in sequence. But prior to its beginning, there's no signs. There's no predictability whatsoever. It's just life as usual. And then boom, it just starts out of nowhere. So then what takes place immediately before this period starts? Of course, it's the church age. He's describing how the church age abruptly comes to an end and the broad day of the Lord suddenly begins. That's in effect what he's talking about, or what we should understand today that he's talking about. They didn't know about a church age back then. But that's what happens that we understand now takes place chronologically right before the sudden beginning of the broad day of the Lord, the Parousia, and its judgments. So that's why chronologically, the pre-trib rapture takes place at that moment. The moment the church age ends and the judgment phase of the broad day starts, the rapture suddenly takes place simultaneously. As the righteous are removed, the beginning of birth pang judgments or the seal judgments immediately start to fall on those who are left behind. And they're trapped inside that period of judgment that ultimately climaxes in the great tribulation and then the second coming proper of Christ. You're going to see this very clearly as we continue. It's so repetitive. You're not going to be able to miss it. And this is the only context that fits. Nothing else works, guys. I'll continue to prove to you what I just said as we go. So in Matthew 24, 5 to 35, and again, that's what I'm calling the first half of the discourse. The focus is all on signs because the disciples had asked him about the signs. And then in verse 33, after talking about the signs, Jesus said that when ye shall see all these signs, know that it is near. Now, what is it? It is referring to the final climactic sign of this sequence of signs, which is his coming in the sky at the end of the tribulation, the second coming proper. So again, follow this. It's by observing this sequence of signs in the day of the Lord, not in the church age, that they can know that the final climactic sign right before the kingdom is now near. It's a during the day of the Lord context. That's verses 5 to 35. But then, when you move to verse 36, continuing to the end of the chapter, and even into chapter 25 until about verse 13, it's the total opposite. The context is on the total absence of signs. Everything now is described as sudden, signless, unpredictable, and without warning for both the righteous and the unrighteous. And this is the consistent theme throughout this latter part of the discourse. For instance, we see in verse 36, it says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, not even the angels in heaven or the Son of Man himself." So it's not just the unrighteous, it's the righteous also who don't know. The point is, nobody can know. Well, what do you mean, Jesus? Even you don't know? But you just told us about the signs that are going to allow it to be known. Okay, now you should be seeing this dilemma, right? Jesus, you said that when they see those things, they can know in verse 33. Now, only a couple of verses later, you're saying the total opposite, that there are no signs and nobody can know. Are you contradicting yourself? No, because verse 36 signals an obvious change in context. Now, if you disagree with what I'm presenting, you're going to have to face that as a contradiction. If you don't understand that there's a change in context, you think it's talking about the same thing, then you have to face that contradiction. He just told you, here's the signs. Now he's saying there are no signs. So it's clearly a change in context. Otherwise, it just makes no sense at all. But I'm pointing the contrast out as one of the several strong points of evidence in the text itself that actually require an understanding of an obvious context shift. It's shifting perspective, guys. It's going now in verse 36 all the way back to the ending of the church age, the conditions that exist immediately prior to the sudden beginning of the broad day of the Lord. Not the end or the climax or the culmination. No, it goes all the way back to before the beginning of those signs start, all right? And how they then begin and arise suddenly out of a time of total signlessness. This is the consistent, constant theme that we're going to now see all through this latter half of the discourse. It's just rephrasing in different ways how this is going to come suddenly, without warning. This is the consistent theme now. And we also see, for instance, in verse 42, ye know not what hour. We see it in verse 44, in such an hour as ye think not. In verse 50, an hour he is not aware of. And also continuing into verse 25, we see it in verse 13. Ye know neither the day nor the hour. And so the continued theme of this latter half is all about nobody being able to know. The fact is that all of the signs Jesus had previously spoke of will not help them know about this context. That shows that it's a different context. A different aspect of the parousia is being described now. The absolute beginning aspect, not the sequence of signs once it starts that leads to the culmination or the ending or the climactic aspect or finale. All right? It's reverting to talk about the beginning. And we know the beginning is when he comes for his church. So from a timing or a chronology standpoint, that's what he's describing. So let's take a closer look at some of these examples that we just alluded to in order to understand them better, to get an even deeper understanding. So here's verses 36 to 39. And once again, this is the shift in context. It starts right here at verse 36. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, there's so much to discuss here, but we know it's a change in context because prior to this, again, it was all about signs, and now it abruptly changes to complete signlessness. Prior to this, it was all about predictability based on those signs, but now it's total unpredictability because there are no signs. And we also see here the example of the days of Noah being used as a comparison or an analogy that so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. But what's he talking about? Because so many people think he's talking about the Nephilim. But guys, the Nephilim are remote from Jesus's intended meaning here for obvious reasons that you can see just from the context and from his actual words, the text itself. I'm sorry, but the Nephilim, demonstrably, it's in the text, it's plain. They have absolutely nothing to do with his intended meaning here. The comparison is in the suddenness of the coming of the judgment. He says it explicitly, how it came upon an unsuspecting population that was caught up in the routine normalcy of life. It was life as usual. So just erase that Nephilim stuff from your mind for just a second and just focus on what Jesus actually says, not what you think he's implying. Focus on what he actually says for a moment, sort of how we should always do Bible study anyway. He tells you exactly why he's using the Noah analogy, guys, and it's not the Nephilim. He says, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now he's going to tell you what he means. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. All right, he's describing a time of total normalcy, routineness of life, total obliviousness to the judgment that was just about to suddenly start, until the day Noah entered into the ark and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. All right, guys, in other words, that's what he meant by the comparison. He's explicitly telling you exactly what he means. He spelled it out. And yet people want to ignore what he actually said and substitute all of this other, honestly, sensationalism at the expense of ignoring the divine and inspired words that are right here on the page. We can't do that. The consequence is that we're going to miss his actual point. And then these same people, a lot of them completely misunderstand the Olivet Discourse because they're focusing on the Nephilim. They're not reading the actual text. We can't do that. What we need to care about is his actual point in the text. And the only thing that actually matters is his point, all right? So we have to set aside our imaginations when we read this and instead focus on the actual text. It tells you exactly what it means without any confusion. He's using the Noah example to show that there will be no signs, no warnings. It came suddenly during a time when people were distracted with the normalcy of life, and the flood came and took them all away. And as a quick note, yes, Noah was preaching for years, warning people. But that's exactly the same as today. We've been preaching and warning people for 2,000 years that it's coming. But the practical effect is that nobody listened back then. Nobody repented. Nobody took it serious. And it came upon them suddenly while they were preoccupied with the normal activities of life. That's the point. But it's much more than that. That's only half of Jesus's point here. The other half that you might not notice at first, but is also explicit in the actual text itself, is that he also says there was a simultaneous rescue of the righteous and a beginning of judgment on the wicked who are left. It's simultaneous. I never hear anybody talking about this. I wrote a book on it. It occurs on the same day with different effects for the two different groups. Look closely at what he says. It's explicit. The wicked were distracted with normal life until the day Noah entered the ark. Okay? Same day. And the flood came suddenly, and they got taken away into immediate judgment. The key is the phrase until the day. Or in other words, the day the righteous are rescued and removed to safety is the same day the judgment began to fall on the wicked who are left behind. It's a simultaneous, same day occurrence. So that's the other half of the comparison or the analogy that Jesus is using with the flood, the days of Noah. It has nothing at all to do with the Nephilim or things being bad on the earth prior to the flood. Not at all. The comparison is actually the opposite. It's that things were normal and people were absorbed in the routineness of life, and the judgment came suddenly on the same day the righteous were removed and rescued. The Noah comparison is based on these two aspects. Now, if you were to go look at Luke 17, which is sort of a parallel teaching where Jesus says the same thing and uses the same analogy, it's made even more explicit that this is a same-day occurrence where the righteous are taken and the judgment immediately starts. Luke 17, 26-30, Jesus uses the same Noah example and says exactly the same thing. But in that recording, he expands the analogy by also equivalently using the example of Lot and the destruction of Sodom. He uses it equivalently to the Noah example. But when he mentions the Lot story, he explicitly says, "But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed." So he explicitly says that the same day Lot and, as we know, his family or the righteous were removed, the judgment immediately began to fall. So I just want this to be clear to you that it's a same day simultaneous occurrence. That's the pattern that we're given, or what I like to call the pattern of the parousia. That's what I mean when I refer to the concept of dual imminence in some of my videos in my book, where the rapture and the broad day of the Lord are both imminent and simultaneous events. Or another way to say it is the rapture is the opening event of the broad day and the parousia. So I just want that to be clear before we continue. And so Jesus's point is exactly this, that the parousia and the broad day of the Lord begin suddenly in this same way as Noah, as Lot, right? And it agrees exactly with what Paul said in Thessalonians 5, 1 Thessalonians 5, that the day of the Lord begins suddenly like birth pangs coming out of nowhere, how they just suddenly start on a woman starting the process of labor. It comes without warning, right? On an unsuspecting population that's occupied with routineness of life. That's what Jesus made clear in these analogies. It says, Paul said, a time of peace and security. That's people's expectation at this time, not an expectation of chaos and signs. And like Jesus says right here, they're eating, they're drinking, they're marrying, they're giving in marriage, etc. What is all that? Normal life, the normal things of life, life as usual, a time like any other. But then suddenly the judgment comes out of nowhere. It's at this exact time, the beginning of the parousia, the opening of the broad day of the Lord, that the rapture takes place. This is what we mean by the pre-trib rapture. Honestly, saying pre-trib isn't even specific enough. It's simultaneous to the beginning of the broad day. We don't know how long before the tribulation that's going to be. But again, like Jesus said, it has to be within a generation, taking into account the 7-year tribulation also. All right. So it's at that point that it suddenly begins. The rapture takes place, removing the righteous to safety immediately before those signs that Jesus talked about. They immediately begin once the people are gone. Just like in the Lot situation, Lot and his family are taken out, righteous are taken out, and immediately on that same day, fire and brimstone. Same as in the example of the days of Noah. Noah and his family, the righteous, they're taken out of harm's way, and immediately the judgment of the flood starts. So that's the context here. And that separation of the righteous from the wicked is then pictured in what Jesus says next, verses 40-44. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in which watch the thief would come, he would have watched, and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. So the first thing we need to recognize, as I already mentioned, is that this is an expansion or a continuation of the same context as the previous verses 36-39, where Jesus is describing the same moment in time, the beginning of the parousia, the start of the broad day, which is the sudden and unpredictable beginning. And whereas he just said in the Noah analogy, the righteous are removed to safety immediately prior to the absolute beginning of a period of judgment on the wicked who are left. And now Jesus is expanding on that here with these examples of the two people where one is taken and one is left. He's talking about the exact same time. And he then continues his elaboration of the suddenness, the signlessness of this point in time by using this thief analogy, and then sums it all up by saying the simple lesson, right? Which is you need to watch. That's the reason you need to watch, because you don't know. There are no signs. There's nothing to indicate when he's coming. So you always need to be ready perpetually, because it's not going to happen when you think, because there are no signs. Just like the coming of a thief, you can't predict it. It's the whole point. Do thieves offer you any predictability? No, that's the whole point. So it's all very clearly a continuation of this same context that began in verse 36, imminence. And the same themes are going to continue even until verse 13 of the next chapter, chapter 25, as I've already said. And so none of this at all, here's the point, none of this can describe the end of the tribulation. It's all directly opposite to that context. Why? Easy, because there's nothing signless. There's nothing unpredictable. There's nothing life as usual at the end of the tribulation. It's the opposite. It's the climax of an extensive sequence of signs, predictable things that the Bible says even the wicked correctly interpreted. We see that in places like Revelation 6, where the wicked correctly understood that they were in the day of the Lord, facing the divine judgments. There was no confusion or anything happening without warning or anyone being taken off guard. Not at all. They knew exactly what was happening, or I should say they will, right? But we saw that in Revelation 6. They knew exactly. It gives us that glimpse into the future. They just refused to repent, guys. They weren't taken off guard by anything. They were just apostate. And at the end of the tribulation, also, there's no beginning of a period of judgment where the righteous are immediately removed before it starts. That doesn't describe the end of the tribulation. That starts the beginning of it all. The end of the tribulation is the total opposite. It's the ending or the climax of the judgment, not the absolute beginning, as is also required in the Noah analogy. Not one raindrop had yet fallen. And in the Lot analogy, no fire, no brimstone had yet fallen, but people were occupied with life as usual, right? Again, this has no correspondence to any time during the tribulation, any time during the broad day of the Lord, the judgment phase, where obviously the judgment has already begun by definition, and life can be considered anything but normal. And the wicked earth dwellers know exactly what's happening, but they knew nothing, Jesus said, in the time before the flood. It says it explicitly here. The people knew nothing. Can we say that the people in the tribulation know nothing? No, the Bible actually says they know exactly what it is. They just refuse to repent. So again, on multiple context points, there's absolutely no similarity between what Jesus is talking about and the end of the tribulation, or any time within the broad day at all once it kicks off. It can only be describing the period of relative normalcy at the end of the church age, where there's no signs, there's no predictability, everything seems as usual, and then suddenly it all kicks off. Suddenly, the righteous are removed, and the wicked are left to experience judgment. That's the only context. And that's why here in verse 40, when Jesus speaks of a separation of the righteous and the wicked, and he's doing it as an expansion of the Noah analogy, where the righteous are removed to safety immediately prior to the beginning of the flood judgment on the wicked who are left behind, it can only be interpreted as a reference to what we today call the rapture, pre-trib rapture, because it's the only time in all of eschatology, all of the entire chronology of eschatology, it's the only time where this context fits. Because nothing can ever again, once it kicks off, nothing can ever again be considered imminent or signless or unpredictable or sudden or coming without warning. ever again, because that's when the signs do start. So imminence immediately disappears from relevance after this point. Nothing after the signs begin can be called signless, obviously, or sudden. And none of the other context points that we've alluded to can ever again exist for the remainder of the chronology of the end times. So, this description in these verses should be extremely clear that they can only fit within the end of the church age and how it transitions to the beginning, the sudden start of eschatology. And that's where we've been for almost 2,000 years, where at any moment this could all kick off. There are no signs to let you know it's coming. It's imminent and it could happen at any time, which is why Jesus uses that analogy of the thief, right? We said it before. Does a thief give you signs of his coming to break into your house, to steal your stuff? No, obviously, that's the whole point. No thief would ever want to give you any warning of his coming. You'd be ready. He'd get arrested. Obviously, that's why Jesus is using this. It's the only way you can use it. It's common sense. That's the whole point. And it's an analogy that anyone can relate to because that's always been the way that thieves operate. They want to come when you're not ready, when you're not looking, when you're not watching, when there's no signs. They're not trying to give you any warning. Otherwise, they get caught, right? A child could understand this. It's so easy. It's so obvious. And so that's what Jesus explains here in the passage, right? In case you're from another planet and you don't know how thieves operate, and therefore you miss the point of the analogy, like so many people have, he says it explicitly here by saying that it's because he's coming like a thief without signs or warnings that you need, therefore, to watch perpetually, not for some sign because there are none, but for him himself. And what does he mean by watch? Does he mean that there's something physical, like a sign to watch for? No, that's missing the point too, and it would be contradictory. It would mean the whole thing makes no sense. He tells you what he means. Look at the first phrase of verse 42, and then the first phrase of verse 44. Guys, it's an equation. Watch therefore, for ye know not, and therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not. So he explicitly defines what he means by watch. He means be ready, be spiritually prepared, be saved, be in a spiritual condition of salvation so that when he arrives, you're able to go with him. It's all predicated on the signlessness and the unpredictability of his coming. So you need to be continually prepared and ready. It's very simple to understand, guys, but people have made this make no sense by applying it to watching for signs, of which the entire point is that there are none. Jesus does not say, watch for signs. He says, watch for him. It's so simple. And we use language like this today all the time. Watch for the bus means that the bus could come at any time. And if you're not watching for it, you're going to miss it because you weren't ready. It doesn't mean watch for signs of the bus. You need to watch for the bus itself. And the implication of watching for the bus is all predicated on you being ready to get on the bus when it comes. So the whole point of the watching is what? The readiness for what's coming. Now, obviously, that's an imperfect analogy because the bus has a scheduled arrival time and this doesn't, but it illustrates how we also use this kind of language today, the term watch in modern culture all the time to refer to something that could come at any time. And the implication of watching is preparation or readiness for that thing, not watching for some signs that don't exist. And that's clearly Jesus's point from the use of the thief analogy and so many other promises that he's in fact coming when you don't think. He tells you over and over because there's no signs that exist to give you any reasons to be able to predict it. Although the internet date setters are very fond of concocting reasons in direct contradiction to this, no, there's no high watch days because the entire point is he's coming at a time you don't think, not at a time you do think, which is the definition of a high watch day. All right? If we just stick to the words of Jesus, if we can, just avoid all this other nonsense, just stick to the Bible, it's going to spare you loads of wasted time, loads of energy and emotion following all that unbiblical nonsense. All right. So going back to this verse once again, once you understand all of this contextual information, the background, then you can know full well that there's only one time that this separation of the righteous from the wicked can occur. When Jesus says, "Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left." That can only be one point in all of eschatology. And it has to describe the separation of the righteous and the wicked when the righteous church gets rescued in what we now call the rapture, and the wicked are left to enter judgment. Or in other words, this is the beginning of the broad day when the parousia starts. It has to be talking about that because it's linked with the verses that require that as the context. It's used as an elaboration of imminence related verses, and imminence only has one time that it fits. Guys, I know I'm being sort of repetitive, but the whole point is that people don't know this. People don't understand this, and they're confused about this discourse. You're going to be confused until you understand imminence and how it shapes the context for you. So this is the beginning of the broad day, the start of the parousia, and it happens out of a time of signlessness at the end of the church age. And once it begins, then the signs begin, which immediately makes imminence, then it immediately loses relevance. That's why imminence is so important for context, because it tells you exactly what it's talking about, because it can only be talking about one time, the absolute beginning, right? So everything from verse 36 to verse 13 of the next chapter all use this same imminence language, these same imminence-related themes, and they all refer to the same beginning point in time, completely opposite from the first half of the discourse, which was all the total opposite context, okay? But there's something else that really helps us to recognize this dramatic shift taking place in verse 36, where Jesus goes from answering the disciples' second question about the what are the signs, now to answering their first question about the when, the timing. There's actually a marker here in the Greek, in the original language, at the beginning of verse 36 that shows this to be the case. This is the Greek phrase peride, which means now concerning, and it's translated here as but of. Jesus says, but of that day and hour. So that's peride, which means now concerning, which is normally used to mark a transition from one subject to another, or to a new aspect of the same subject, but it's marking a shift. And that's obviously what he's doing, as the text tells us. He says, but of, or now concerning, now switching context to the day and the hour. Or in other words, now I'm going to transition from answering the what question about the signs now to answering the when question about the timing, about the day and the hour. He's going from the second question to the first question. And so you should expect a shift in context. And here is the peride to show you that a shift in context is taking place, right? The peride signals that shift about as naturally as anyone would do in a normal conversation, right? A shift not to an entirely new subject. He's still answering the questions about his parousia, about the broad day of the Lord, but he's now moving to a different aspect of it, the timing aspect, because he's now moving to answer their other question. So I hope the light is clicking on for you guys. It's so obvious once it's pointed out. It was like that for me too. Once I found good resources like the one that actually I'm about to quote from. So this is Dr. Robert L. Thomas, and he says this about what I just told you about the usage of peride here in verse 36. He says, the day that begins verse 36 must be transitional because the 36th verse changes the discussion of signs preceding the second coming proper to emphasize that no signs will precede the parousia, the beginning of the broad day. Peride in 2436 is a frequent device for introducing a change from one phase of a subject to another phase of the same subject, or from one subject to another subject. The verse introduces an aspect of the coming different from the one pointed to in Matthew 24:29 to 31. The verb depicting the coming in 24:30 is erchomenon, but the noun designating the coming in 24:37 is parousia, a term that easily covers a wider span. So Dr. Thomas points out that Jesus uses the Greek word erchomenon to refer to the aspect of his coming that's described in verses 29 to 31 earlier in the chapter, which refers to the end of the tribulation. It's that ending aspect of his parousia. But elsewhere in the discourse, Jesus often uses the word parousia, and they're both translated the same into the English as coming, erchomenon and parousia. And so you could easily miss this nuance of them being different. You wouldn't notice it really in the English, but it's explicit in the Greek. They're different words. And he's referring to different aspects of his coming. He uses erchomenon when he describes the ending aspect of his coming, the climactic part, while parousia, as Dr. Thomas mentioned, refers to a wider or a broader period. So in other words, parousia is the entire thing, the entire broader, wider period of his coming. And in verse 37, he uses it to refer to the beginning of this period very clearly. Now, in other parts of the New Testament, parousia can be used to refer to any part of it, the beginning aspect, the ending aspect, whatever. And yet, here, that's another reason why we understand it to be a protracted period of time, not a singular moment. As, for example, erchomenon is being used here. So the point is that even this transition from Jesus using erchomenon in 29, verses 29 to 31, to then using parousia in verse 37, after using the peride in verse 36 to signal a context change, that itself helps to support that obvious shift in the Greek, right? So I hope you're catching all this. It's all evidence that supports what I'm presenting to you that may not come across so clearly in the English. Now, if we were to look at the other recordings of the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Luke 21, we would also see this shift that we've been talking about. We would find it in Mark 13, 32 to 37, and in Luke 21, 34 to 36. I'm going to show you those. So let me take you first to Luke 21. Now, to have a better perspective, we need to start by backing up a couple of verses in this chapter to better see how Luke 21 aligns kind of side by side to what we just saw in Matthew 24 and to better perceive this shift. So we're going to begin with the verses that parallel the fig tree verses in Matthew 24. That would be Luke 21, 28 to 30. And remember, this is part of what in Matthew we've been calling the first half of the discourse, which has its context in the sequence of signs within the broad day, climaxing in the physical coming of Christ, the second coming proper, at the end of the tribulation. This is the parallel of that in Luke 21. And Jesus says this, and when these things, meaning all the broad day of the Lord signs that Jesus just talked about, begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. And he spake to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees, when they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when ye shall see these things come to pass, that he just talked about, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all be fulfilled. That's Luke 21, 28 to 30. Okay, so let's first notice that when Jesus refers to these things, again, he's referring to the sequence of signs that he just talked about, which we saw also in Matthew 24, that started with the beginning of birth pang signs, all in the broad day of the Lord. All things that begin to happen after the righteous church is taken out at the rapture. Right? This is all in answer to the disciples' question about the signs. And after the birth pang signs, he discusses the tribulation signs. So all this is speaking to righteous remnant believers in the day of the Lord, in the tribulation saints. It's not talking to the church. And here he says that when these things come to pass, it's only then, because they've seen the signs, that these tribulation saints, as we often call them, can lift up their heads and expect to see their redemption about to come to pass. Of course, meaning the second coming proper of Christ at the end of the tribulation. Now, let me just pause and say, I often hear people misinterpreting, dispensationally misapplying this passage and applying it to today. This saying of lift up your heads for your redemption is drawing nigh. And people are applying it to the rapture, that in the church age, this instruction applies to us, that there's something that we're supposed to see in the church age that's going to tell us when the rapture is. But I hope you can see from our very clear, consistent discussion here that it absolutely in no way can apply to the church. The context is the day of the Lord. If you're a pre-trib believer, you really can't apply this to the church. You got to stop using this to apply to the rapture or to give yourself some kind of instruction to lift up your head for your redemption is coming because you've seen some kind of signs. No, there's no signs, and this isn't talking to you. That's the total opposite of everything that we're always told about the rapture, which is that it has no signs, comes suddenly, imminently, unpredictably, without warning. Just be ready, okay? So the context has to guide our understanding. The signs being mentioned here refer obviously back to the signs that Jesus just talked about, which all happen during the day of the Lord, as we meticulously proved in the first video. And all are things that we haven't seen and won't see because they won't happen until we're gone. But so often, again, I see these so-called prophecy teachers bringing up things happening in the world today, which they're actually things Jesus doesn't mention, like AI or something like that, something they're calling mark of the beast technology, that because we're seeing that stuff, then we're able to say, well, now we can lift up our heads. The rapture's coming. No, we need to rightly interpret and not be careless. Someone teaching that is probably not somebody you should ever be listening to about this subject, right? So after this, Jesus then speaks to them the parable of the fig tree to summarize what he just said about once the remnant, the righteous remnant in the day of the Lord see these things, it's only then that they can expect his actual coming visibly, where all eyes will see him at the end of the tribulation, his coming in glory, the second coming proper. And the fig tree is used to illustrate that point, that once you see the blossoming of the fig tree, you know by that sign, the fruit is coming, summer's coming. And so often I hear people misapplying this fig tree parable also to today. No, it doesn't apply to the church. I believe it was Hal Lindsey who invented or at least popularized this ridiculous view that allegorically applies Israel becoming a nation in 1948 to the blossoming of the fig tree and says that the rapture is going to happen within a generation of 1948. And guys, it's unfortunate that so many people have been deceived by this, but hopefully by now, at this point in this study, you can see how impossible that view is. It's impossible. First, the context is wrong. It's not speaking about the church or the church age. It's speaking of the signs in the broad day that take place after the church is taken out. So very easily, if you're a pre-trib believer, you can't apply this to the church. Now, it's also predicted on signs, or predicated, I should say. It's all predicated on signs. And the rapture is always spoken of as being imminent, without signs, sudden, unpredictable. We're not waiting to see anything to expect the rapture. The rapture could happen at any moment. And it has been. It has been able to happen at any moment for the entire church age, according to the New Testament writers. Guys, they're writing this to us, but they're also writing it to the first century audience. They were telling them back then that it's imminent. Just look for it. Just be ready. So we can't now, 2,000 years later, say, well, actually, because we've seen some signs that the Bible never says that we need to see, now we can expect it as imminent. No, they were told 2,000 years ago it was imminent then. Okay, and then thirdly, also, it uses an allegorical interpretation, which destroys the literal meaning that Jesus intended. He was using the analogy of the fig tree not to allegorically refer to Israel, and somehow you're just supposed to know that, even though it's not in the text, and then it makes what's in the text meaningless. No, it was not referring to Israel becoming a nation in 1948. Absolutely not. He never mentioned that. But he was literally referring to the actual signs that he actually just stated, obviously. And the blossoming of the fig tree was an allegory that hearkened back to those signs that he just said. When they see them, it indicates the second coming proper at the end of the tribulation can then be expected. So, inputting this allegorical Israel interpretation means that you have to deny this actual, obvious, literal meaning that's in the text. It's right there in the text. What do you do with that if you absorb or if you embrace this view about Israel? You can't embrace both. You're either going to accept what it literally says or what it allegorically says. It's an allegory about something literal he just said. It's not an allegory about something allegorical. That makes no sense. So everything about this interpretation is ridiculous, wrong, totally opposite of what it actually says, which even a child can understand. I mean, this is just like if you know how to read a book, you know how to interpret this. It's simple. There's nothing difficult about it. Jesus is saying what he actually means. He's saying that the same generation that sees the beginning of the signs that he just described is the same generation that's going to see the finality of it, the finale, right? When Jesus appears physically in the sky as the final sign, the second coming proper at the end of the tribulation. Simple. And the fig tree is an analogy that says that. All right, so before we go on, let me say this also. If you're claiming that the beginning of the birth pang signs applies to the church, then you're not only putting the church in the day of the Lord, but you're also saying that the church is going to be there the entire time through the tribulation, because that's Jesus's whole point, that the same people who see the beginning of the birth pang signs are going to be there to witness the final sign of him coming at the end of the tribulation. That's his whole point. It's the same generation. So obviously, if a pre-trib believer can't make this claim logically, right? It contradicts what it means to believe in a pre-trib rapture. So Jesus is limiting all of this to one generation. It won't continue for hundreds or thousands of years, in other words. That's what he's saying. The people who see the beginning are going to be there to see the end. So with that said, which anchors the context here as all referring to the day of the Lord, culminating in the second coming proper, let's now turn our attention to verses 34 to 36, where we see this shift in context take place. Just like in Matthew 24:36, I'm going to show you this now in Luke, the latter half of the discourse. All right? We see the same shift here. Only in Luke, it's just 3 verses. Not an entire latter half of the discourse like in Matthew. But these 3 verses, verse 34, 35, and 36, align with the latter half of Matthew 24, and even continuing into Matthew 25 until about verse 13. So as we read this, see if you can note the shift in context, the change in language. See the change from signs to now signlessness, from predictability to now unpredictability, from imminence to non-imminence. Jesus says this, "And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and so that day, the day of the Lord, come upon you unawares. For as a snare or a trap, meaning suddenly or signlessly, shall it come upon all them that dwell upon the face of the whole earth. Watch ye therefore, and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape," think the rapture, "escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man." All right, so did you notice the language change? The day of the Lord is going to come like a snare or a trap. You're walking by oblivious, and then you step into a trap and it snaps suddenly, without warning, taking you by surprise. There are no signs. Yet before, Jesus said that there's all these signs. And in Revelation, we see the wicked correctly interpreting the signs to mean that they're in the day of the Lord experiencing judgment. And in their apostasy and their rebellion, they're actually preparing to physically battle the Lord when he comes at the end of the tribulation. So none of that makes sense. That, of course, can't be the context here. Here it has to be referring to the absolute beginning of that time period as a whole, which does come suddenly like a snare. And once it comes, they're in it. And they start experiencing the judgment, seeing the signs, and they know that they're in it. Now, this verse also says that the righteous are told to watch, which is what we saw continually in the latter half of Matthew. And the call to eschatological watchfulness always indicates an imminent context, always. Because the whole point is that this aspect of the parousia, the beginning aspect, has no signs whatsoever and can occur at any moment. Therefore, as Jesus said, it's common sense that you must watch for the Lord himself, not a sign, him himself, perpetually, which means being spiritually ready, being saved. Okay? Watchfulness is only used in imminence contexts. People in the tribulation are never told to watch for the sudden coming of Christ. That's not how it's ever used. It's always used only to express imminence, never during the day of the Lord, only before it suddenly starts. And then it mentions that we could actually be accounted worthy to escape or to avoid all of these things. Again, what's all of these things? All the day of the Lord signs that Jesus talked about. So in other words, the righteous who are accounted worthy to escape because they obeyed the instruction to watch or be spiritually ready can avoid entering into this period. That's the only way to avoid them, because Revelation very clearly tells us that people in that time period who do turn to Christ are going to be greatly abused and persecuted by the Antichrist, and will obviously be subject to much of the global and the cosmic judgments that take place during that time. The seals, the trumpets, the bowls. Saved people at that time are going to be subject to a lot of that. Many are going to actually die during that time. But here it talks about a way of avoiding all of it before it starts, and instead standing before the Son of Man. Guys, that, of course, obviously, common sense, can only be a pre-trib rapture. That's the only thing that would fit at all. And it aligns exactly with what was said also in Matthew 24, where Jesus referred to the righteous in Noah's day being taken to safety, removed to safety, think rapture, at the same time that the judgment came upon, against those who are left behind. And how he then elaborated on that with the one taken and the one left. There's a separation that happens at the absolute beginning of this time period, the beginning of when the judgment starts, not the climax or the ending, according to all these accounts. And later in the New Testament, especially in the writings of Paul, we find out more about this separation or this escape. And we learn that he refers to it as the harpazo in the Greek, which through the translation of harpazo into the Latin Vulgate, we get our English term, the rapture. Right? At that time, they didn't have fully developed rapture doctrine when Jesus was talking about this stuff. But very clearly, regardless of that, Jesus was planting seed doctrine that would later, eventually, progressively get developed by Paul and even by Jesus himself in John 14, 1-3. But the point is that Jesus was teaching a separation, a rescue of the righteous at the beginning of this point of judgment. That's the simple point that even they at that time could understand, knowing nothing about the church, knowing nothing really about the rapture. They could understand that at that time when Jesus gave that teaching, that discourse. That's all he's saying, right? A separation of the righteous from the wicked at the beginning of judgment. The righteous are taken to safety. Simple. And so just like Matthew 24:36, these verses here in Luke are reverting from the sequence of signs that Jesus had just described to now discussing the absolute beginning, the sudden beginning of that period. And it's telling you there's a way you can avoid entering into this period of judgment and experiencing those signs, those judgments. That right there explicitly tells you that the context changed to before the signs had begun. Obviously, just think about that. If it's telling you you can avoid experiencing these things, then obviously it has to be talking about a context before those things start. So it's explicit that there's a shift in context. It's speaking about how the day begins and comes upon them unaware, like a snare. That obviously means the context is immediately prior to the beginning of the broad day. The broad day hasn't happened yet. And this also aligns perfectly with what Paul also said in 1 Thessalonians 5, how the day comes on them suddenly, and how the righteous can avoid entrance into that period by the rapture, which was his whole context, so that the day of the Lord would not overtake them. And so we can see how these passages and these themes perfectly align with the latter half of Matthew 24. All right, so let's now move ahead to Mark 13:28 to 30, the parallel of these in Mark's recording. And we're going to see the same exact shift take place in the verses that follow, which are going to be verses 32 to 37. But verses 28 to 30 are still dealing with the end of the day of the Lord. So we see the same mention that we saw in Matthew and in Luke about the fig tree, discussing all the day of the Lord signs. It says this, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When her branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is near. So ye in like manner, when ye shall see these things come to pass, know that it is nigh, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done." Mark 13:28 to 30. And so it's just like we saw in Matthew and in Luke. Once you see all the signs in the day of the Lord, you can know that the ending or the climax of it, the climax of the judgment phase, the second coming proper at the end of the tribulation, is about to happen, where Jesus comes back to the earth physically. Once again, we're not going to be here to see any of those signs. We're raptured right before they initiate. But all this is very relevant for the people who get left behind and come to faith during that time. So I hope all this repetition is allowing you to get all of this. It's the same thing. All right, let's move on. The verses that follow, verses 33 to 37, we're going to see the exact same context shift that we just saw in Matthew and Luke, where the perspective now abruptly changes. The language abruptly changes from the end of the tribulation now back to the beginning of the broad day as a whole, as Jesus starts to answer the disciples' first question. So again, as we read this, see if you can note this obvious shift. It says, "But of," and that's peri day, "that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. Take ye heed, watch and pray, for ye know not when the time is. For the Son of Man is as a man taking a far journey, who left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to every man his work, and commanded the porter to watch. Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh, at even, or at midnight, or at the cock crowing, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch." All right, guys, so just like in the other accounts in Matthew and Luke, this is packed full of contextual information showing the shift. It starts right in verse 33 with the "but of," or the peri day. We've been over all of this repeatedly in this video already, so I won't go through all of it. But we see now that this aspect of the coming that he's now shifting to talk about, this is a signless aspect. This is a unpredictable aspect where not even the holy angels in heaven know anything about the timing, or the Son of Man himself, Jesus himself, which is illustrated now in his introduction of a homeowner taking a journey and his servants being expected to expect him imminently at any moment on an ongoing basis, to be ready for his surprise arrival. Or else, if he comes while they're sleeping, there's going to be a negative consequence, right? And this master coming home is one of the imminence idioms that Jesus uses. And then later New Testament writers like James also used it, and they clearly applied it to the rapture in the epistles, which tells us Jesus's context here. That's how they understood it, so that's how we have to understand it. But notice that Jesus's return is described again as sudden, which is the reason for his command to be always watching, or always spiritually prepared and ready to go when he comes. His coming is sudden to everyone. Our job is to then be perpetually ready, not to try to predict it. That's not our job. You guys who are watching all these prediction channels all the time, you're not told to do that. What you're told is so simple. Just be ready so that when he comes, you'll be able to go with him. That's it. He doesn't say to predict the timing. He actually says you're not going to be able to. He promises he's coming at a time you're not going to know. So just be ready. He's coming unpredictably, suddenly, so that whenever it does happen, you're going to be ready, not because you're able to predict it. Being able to predict it is impossible, but even so, that doesn't make you ready, right? But because if you're always ready for a pop quiz, it doesn't matter when the pop quiz comes, you're going to be ready. The same goes for this aspect of the Lord's coming, the opening aspect, the starting aspect. It's imminent. And so we see imminence all throughout this. Whereas in the previous verses, it was all about signs, all about predictability, right? So I hope you guys are catching on to this now. It's the same thing in all of them. So this here, of course, can have nothing to do with the tribulation in the day of the Lord, which is all filled with signs, filled with predictability. And we know exactly how long the tribulation lasts. We know from Daniel 9, the sign that marks the beginning, the midpoint. So his coming at the end of the tribulation is completely predictable once all these signs start. That's the point, actually. And none of the idioms, none of the language that we see here in verses 33 to 37 can in any way relate to that context. It's all the total opposite. It can only describe the ending of the church age prior to the sudden beginning of this period called the broad day, the day of the Lord in its broad sense. This is the only point that can take anybody off guard suddenly. And once that happens, it begins. And the signs are seen by those who are left. And they can no longer be taken off guard suddenly because they're already in that period where they're experiencing these constant judgments. They can't be taken off guard by judgment that they're already experiencing, which, as we said before, these wicked people rightly interpret. They know exactly what's happening. They know they're in the day of the Lord, experiencing his wrath. They say it themselves in Revelation 6. So no context of suddenness, signlessness, unpredictability, imminence, or without warning can ever again be relevant. So all of this is so obvious when you simply understand context. And imminence shows us the context. So let me show you another quote. This one is from Dr. John Hart that basically says what I just told you. And he says this while referring back to the context shift in verse 36 of the Matthew account. And you'll see he calls it verses 36 to 44. But it's really referring to the entire latter half of the discourse that I'm saying goes to about 25:13. Right? So he says this: while the second coming of Christ is as highly predictable through preceding signs as summer is predictable to the signs of the springtime budding of a fig tree, verses 32 to 36, verses 36 to 44 present a contrasting event. Verses 36 to 44 describe the imminent, unpredictable coming of the day of the Lord. As such, the Lord now answers the first question of the disciples from verse 3 about when the end time events will commence, when this whole period starts. When the events within the day of the Lord are present, then Christ's coming, the second coming proper, right, at the end of the tribulation, is near. But the timing of the broad day of the Lord itself, this wider period, cannot be known. All right, guys, the contrasting halves of the discourse is really the main takeaway from this video. If you keep that contrast or that shift beginning at verse 36 in mind, and you allow the clear and obvious imminence language of the text, it's right in the text constantly. If you allow that to guide you, you're going to be in good shape for understanding the discourse as a whole. All right, so that's going to be it for this video. In the next one, we're going to use everything that we talked about so far about context to arrive at some very strong conclusions about identifying the righteous in this discourse. Now, obviously, we've already said the answer, the obvious answer all throughout this video, but I wanted to take some time to do a separate video and distill it down because there was a lot of information in this video and in the previous one. And if this is all new to you, I would imagine that your mind needs to rest a little bit and digest everything that we talked about. Maybe even rewatch the video. It was definitely that way for me when I first started to understand it. It's not complicated per se, but it's actually very clear, very obvious, very straightforward, but it's new information nonetheless. So that's going to take some time to settle into your understanding. All right. So when we discuss our conclusions in the next video, hopefully it's going to drive these main points of context home for you in a very clear way. All right. So I want to thank you guys all for watching. I really hope that you're enjoying this series so far. Please leave me your thoughts, your comments. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you've heard the Olivet Discourse ever being taught like this, or if this is completely new. All right. I love getting your feedback. But until next time, God bless you all, and I will see you on the next video.